So thank you very much, and I will try to talk about how we move from kind of intrinsic kind of goal-directedness into something that could actually be defined as teleology, something that requires some kind of mental state, subjectively experienced mental state, or reflective design. Okay, just a second. So I want to thank my colleagues and friends, Simona Ginsburg and Anna Zeligovsky. Anna Zeligovsky did the pictures that you will see, and my students and colleagues who contributed to this book. Now, the question that the question can be asked in following Dennett's kind of phrase: how do we go from doing things for a reason, for having reasons for doing things? And I will define, in order so that we have a common language, a teleonomic behavior as a goal-directed behavior that does not depend on conscious will or preconceived design. Reasons here are phylogenetically selective adaptive decrees that have nothing whatsoever to do with subjective experiencing or reflective design. Mental states, on the other hand, are reasons to do things, and they are based on ontogenetic learning, conscious percepts, and satisfaction of felt needs. The goals to be satisfied are constructed by the organism, and in this sense, they are teleonomic. But the objects of the goals and the felt needs, for example, the food, the air, the mates, the body integrity, they are perceived by the organisms as goals to be reached. And there are representations, mental representations within the organisms that represent these goals, which are perceived as external to the organism. And then we have also reasoned reasons, which require a symbolic system. They, in addition to the external goals that satisfy private felt needs animals have, are also symbolic needs that are based on shared norms. And this is something that is special to humans, to us, as far as we know. Now, the kind of approach that we adopt is, me and Simona Ginsburg and my colleagues with whom I worked, are a kind of neo-Aristotelian kind of approach. And following Aristotle, we distinguish between three modes of being, what we call modes of being: a living, non-sentient mode of being, a sentient mode of being, and a rational, symbolic, human mode of being. So, and since these modes of being are biological, they have evolved. And what is this kind of carving of reality means that each of this mode of beings is delineated by sets of value systems. And there are new types of goals for each of the teleological modes of being, and I will explain what I mean by that. Okay, so here is Aristotle, just to give you a feel of how we think about this and where we draw our kind of inspiration from. He said in De Anima, on the soul: of the psychic powers above enumerated, that's after a big discussion, some kinds of living things, as I have said, possess all, some less than all, other only one. Those that we have mentioned are the nutritive, the appetitive, the sensory, the locomotive, and the power of thinking. Plants have only the first, the nutritive, while other orders of living things have this plus the sensory. By the sensory, by the way, he means actual subjective feeling, not just having a sensory ability in the sense of having a receptor and an ability to respond to stimuli, but actually having a subjective kind of experiencing. And lastly, certain living beings, a small minority, possess calculation and thought. For among mortal beings, those which possess calculations have all the other powers above mentioned. So he's talking about three types of what he calls souls: the nutritive soul, where you have a kind of intrinsic teleology, and the kind of sensitive souls, which have appetites, which are directed to things, to goals, which are perceived by the organisms as something to be reached outside it, and the reflective kind of, or the rational kind of soul, which is based on self-reflection and on symbolic goals, such as the desire to reach the beautiful, the just, the good, and so on. And here is just a small depiction of this Aristotelian souls, the nutritive and reproductive. He, by the way, uses both, and he says that the nutritive is also the reproductive in living organisms, the sensitive that also is nutritive and reproductive, and the rational that in mortal beings is also sensitive and nutritive reproductive. So it's kind of nested hierarchy. A similar but not identical kind of carving of reality has been suggested by Daniel Dennett. And he suggested a scheme that is based on kind of targets of selections. And his targets of selections are genes, behaviors, imagined action plans, and symbolic ideas, each of which can be selected. And he's talking about a tower of generate and test, kind of tower where each new floor of the tower gets constructed. As it gets constructed, it empowers the organisms at that level to find better and better moves and find them more efficiently. And here here are what he calls Darwinian organisms, where design is through natural selection during phylogeny. Here we have what he calls Skinnerian organisms, where design is through the selective reinforcement of behaviors. And here's Skinner, where inherited behavior leaves off, the inherited modifiability of the process of conditioning takes over. This is learning by consequence and selection through reinforcement of behaviors. And here are the Popperian organisms, those where design is through selection among imagined scenarios. And here are what he calls the Gregorian organisms, where design is through selection, symbolic representations. And this is something that seems to be very highly developed in humans, obviously, and probably specific to us. Now, I want to look at it this modes of being from an evolutionary point of view, specifically to look at how a teleological kind of mode of being that is based on subjective experiencing, on mental states, on kind of representations of goals that are perceived as goals by the organism. How did it happen? So I'm asking, how did the evolutionary transition from non-conscious teleonomic organization to the first minimal level of conscious teleological organization occur? And in order to do that, I am looking at a methodology and way of thinking that was developed by a great Hungarian chemist, Tibor Ganti, one of the fathers of systems chemistry, and that was further developed by Minor, Smith, and Sudbury for the origin of life. What Ganti asked is the following: how can we characterize a minimal teleonomic living system and evolutionary transition to it? And what he said, and the way that he approached this problem is the following. He said, although no one agrees precisely about what life is, there is enough consensus in the community of people who work on this about the capacity that a system would need to have to be recognized as living. So if we come to a different planet and we find a system with a certain with a certain type of capacities, we will say, well, we can say that this system exhibits life. What are these capacities? So Ganti gave us a list. He said maintenance of a boundary, which is individuation, metabolism, stability, information storage, regulation of the internal milieu, growth, reproduction, and death, which is irreversible disintegration. And he also identified one capacity that requires that all the entries in the list are in place. So there is a single capacity, and I will talk about it a little bit, that if it is in place, all this list of capacities that characterize the mode of being that we called living exists. And then he built a toy model of such a system. So this capacity that actually requires that the whole list of capacities characterize life is in place, we call it an evolutionary transition marker. And according to Ganti, and then also it was elaborated also by Mann, Smith, and Satmary, the evolutionary transition marker for sustainable life is what is the capacity of unlimited heredity. And unlimited heredity is the capacity to, it's not unlimited in the mathematical sense. It is unlimited in the sense that that there is a capacity to form lineage of open-ended length, varying in open-ended ways from the initial system. And the example that we know from the world in which we live is the nucleic acid system. And this is an example of an unlimited heredity system. And once we have a transition marker, such as unlimited heredity, and we identify it, we can reverse engineer from this capacity to the system that enables it. So here is the basic logic of the whole thing. We start with a list: individuation, metabolism, stability, at the bottom of this illustration, and this list is sufficient for a definition of a system as a living system. And we find a single capacity that, if it exists, it requires that all the capacities that are in the list are in place. And this capacity, unlimited heredity in the case of life, marks the presence of a living system. And it also allows us to reverse engineer from the capacity, from this evolutionary marker, to the system that enables it. So if we find, for example, on Mars, something like a molecule that in theory can be self-replicating, long molecules and so on, that, and not one, but several, so they could not have been synthesized spontaneously, we could reverse from this long polymer a system that can lead to its synthesis, and this system will have all the capacity, all the properties that are necessary to define a system as minimally living. And then he created a model, the chemoton. It's an autopoietic model of minimal living system. By the way, just to do justice, he developed this model, which is a very detailed, relatively detailed chemical model, more or less at the same time that Maturana and Varela, and independently of them, developed their notion of autopoietic system. And in this system, we have an input of food, we have waste products, and we have several systems that allow the construction of a boundary, a metabolic, kind of self-renewing metabolic cycle, and also a kind of informational subsistence that is allowing the system to persist and to create, to vary in a way that ensures its persistence over long evolutionary times. I will not go into the system, it's very interesting, but that's a different story. But this is basically what he suggested. So he gave us a list, he identified a capacity that requires that the list is in place. This is the evolutionary transition marker, and he built a model of a system that actualizes and manifests all the properties in the list. Now, we can generalize this approach. We can say, generally, an evolutionary transition marker is a property such that when we find evidence of it, we have evidence that the major teleological evolutionary transition in which we are interested has come to completion. And as I said, we recognize three such great teleological transitions: the transition to life, the transition to subjective experiencing, and the transition to rationality. So this is the basic idea of the transition marker. We have a list of capacities that is sufficient for a description of a mode, for the characterization and identification of a mode of being. And we identify a single property of capacity that requires that the list of capacities that we started with is in place. And this is the transition marker for that mode of being. So what about subjective experiencing? What can we say about that? Now, let's think about Tinbergen. Tinbergen, when he was trying to think about the organism, how we should think about behavior, he was thinking mainly about animal behavior, but we can think also about plant behavior, for example, about how the sunflowers moves towards the sun. He asked, well, the question that we really need to answer is, why do these animals or organisms behave as they do? And he said that we have to ask 4 questions about causes if we want to answer this big question. The first, and we have to think about the mechanistic cause of the behavior, the mechanisms, the ontogenetic cause of the behavior, how it developed, the functional cause of the behavior, what it is good for, and the evolutionary cause of behavior that doesn't have to be the same as the functional, by the way. Then one thing can be, a particular behavior can be good or something for one thing, but the reason that it evolved and its evolutionary history is completely different. And he said, well, we can't think about subjective experiencing not because it is not the cause, because in theory, we could ask, for example, when we ask ourselves, why did the frog say, well, jump because he was afraid? Now, is this not a cause? Why is it not within the list of Tinbergen? He was aware of that. And in a footnote, he added, the ethologist does not want to deny the possible existence of subjective phenomena in animals. He claims it is futile to present them as causes since they cannot be observed by scientific methods. This was in 1951, and 70 years later, I think this is no longer a futile question. We can ask about the mental causes of a behavior. So let's apply the kind of methodology, and this is what we did. I'm talking about Simona Ginsburg and myself, when we were trying to think about the evolutionary origins of minimal consciousness. So what is the list? Here is a suggestion of a list that is more or less a consensus. If we will find an organism with all these capacities on a different planet, we will try to treat it with some amount of respect, not to hurt its feelings. So what are these capacities? One is binding and unification. For example, when we see something, we see the apple as both green and round. Global accessibility and broadcast. We form beliefs, we form multimodal integrations, generalizations, we have memories, and so on. And all these things combine together to create the kind of subjective experiencing that we have. There's always selective attention and active exclusion. There's a lot of noise all the time, which we have to exclude. And we have something that we can call attentional skills. We select certain things to attend to, we switch attention, and we sustain attention. There is something that philosophers call intentionality, aboutness, and they mean something like representation. And in simpler terms, it is a mapping, a neural mapping of the body, of the world, of action that is represented within us. There is integration through time. Subjective experience things have a duration. There's a flexible evaluative system. We prioritize the kind of stimuli that we get according to the context and salience. We are proactive creatures. We are not just reactive. All living organisms, by the way, are proactive. There is embodiment. There is a kind of object-oriented spatial cognition that requires many degrees of freedom of movement in subjectively experiencing organisms. And there is a kind of registration of self-other and the stable private perspective, a sense of body ownership and ego center. So this is a list of capacities that if we find them in an entity, we would say, well, there is a very good chance that this entity is something like experiencing creature, not necessarily one that thinks about thoughts or something complicated like us, but something with minimal consciousness, with a minimal ability for subjective experiencing. And then we looked for a transition marker kind of thing, something that a single capacity that if we have it, we can say that all this list, of capacity that I showed you in the previous slide has to be in place. And after quite a lot of bad starts, we found a capacity that we called the capacity for unlimited associative learning. It is a general, it's a domain general, generative and recursive learning capacity that requires that the animals can do 4 things. It can distinguish among novel compound patterns of stimuli and action. For example, it can discriminate between a dangerous and self-percept that could be very similar but somewhat different in organization. It can learn about new adaptive values and of compound associations, and all these learned things, all of the things that are novel to it. They are not the patterns that it learns are not reflex eliciting patterns, and they have not been learned in the past. It can also learn when there is a time gap between the neutral complex stimulus, the predictive stimulus in retrospect, and the reinforcement. This is called trace conditioning by behaviorists and other people who study this kind of conditional behavior. And it requires that there is some kind of mechanism that stores the neutral predictive stimulus, even stores it in some kind of working memory, even when the reinforcing stimulus is transiently unperceived. And the value of the learned pattern can be flexibly changed, so something that is good now can be bad later. And a creature with this kind of learning capacity can manifest second-order learning, so that the things that the new complex thing that it learned can be the basis for further learning. So the organism can build up chains of associative links. Now, this is, you can say this is demanding, but it's not very demanding. A lot of organisms can do all this. And just here is just one example of something that an organism like a mouse can do. A mouse can very easily has the capacity for this unlimited associative learning. For example, spatial learning is one example. It can learn about its environment. It can learn when there is food, it can learn different routes to the food. It can learn when there are dangerous predators. It can learn all kinds of where mates may be present. A lot of things, and these things can change in time, and it can adapt and update its its understanding of this map of the environment and respond adaptively online. And all the things that I have listed, the global broadcast, the binding ability, the selective attention, all these kind of things that we say are sufficient for a characterization of the experiencing kind of subjectively experiencing mode of being, are marked by unlimited associative learning, because unlimited associative learning requires that all these properties are in place. Now, then we said, okay, let's build something very, very simple, just a simple toy model in order to organize our thought of what this kind of system can be like. And here is something very, very simple. What we have here is the basic elements of this kind of system. What the system has to do is to have a sensory integrating unit, which integrates sensory information from the body, from the world. And we have to have a motor integrating unit that can sort of that can model prospective action. We have to have a reinforcement unit that can model the inputs that are coming from the body, and have particular valence, what is good, what is bad, all the homeostatic signals. We have to have a dedicated memory system that can store compound percepts and create things like cognitive maps, for example, and other types of maps. And all these things have to come together into a kind of central associative units. And this the associative unit, by the way, like all the other units, can be distributed, or it can be in or anatomically distributed.
Eva, I'm sorry to disturb you.
When you have,
Eva, you've got 4 minutes left, please.
yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so I don't have time for this. Okay, so this is and this unlimited associative learning is a system property. And we have evidence that and moreover, and the link between this unlimited associative learning and consciousness is that if we are right, then we predict that an animal can learn unlimited associative learning tasks such as trace conditioning or discrimination or complex discrimination learning and so on, only when it is constant. It cannot do it under conditions of implicit learning. And all the evidence that we have in place, mostly in humans, but also now people are beginning to do it in animals, shows that this is indeed the case. Simpler things can be learned implicitly, but UAL tasks require consciousness, certainly in humans. Okay, so how is this distributed in the world? Which animal groups show unlimited associative learning? There are 3 groups. Almost all, probably all the vertebrates or most of them. Many groups of arthropods, and the coleoid mollusks, which are the octopus, the squid, and the cuttlefish. All of them show a similar functional brain architecture, although the structural architecture is completely different. And 2 of them, the arthropod and the vertebrates, appeared first in the Cambrian with the supporting brain organization, because we have the fossil evidence for it. The cephalopods appeared 250,000 million years later. Now, we argue that not only were these animals did consciousness appear during the Cambrian. What you see here, the 3 groups are shown as gray circles with rays. Not only did they appear during the Cambrian, but they also were one of the things that drove the Cambrian explosion, the great explosion of animal life on this planet. It was what we call, following Patrick Bateson, the adaptability driver of the Cambrian explosion. This ability to learn led to antagonistic and cooperative arms races and feedbacks, and it was one of the engines of the Great Explosion. And it had all kinds of effects, and one of the effects is that the kind of complex pattern that we see in the world, we would not see them had it not been for the kind of open-ended associative learning which requires subjective, which is associated, is facet of a subjective experiencing. So, for example, the beautiful patterns on this male fish would not be there if there was not a female that was able to identify them and to compare him to other males. The beautiful patterns of the flower would not exist had it not been for arthropods like this dragonfly, who could identify them and discriminate between and make decisions about them. It's very interesting that wind-pollinated flowers don't have this kind of complex patterns and complex smells as do those that are pollinated by animals. And the beautiful bowerbirds we would not have things of beauty like the bowers built by the bowerbirds. I cannot say any more about the great transition to the rational soul, and I want to thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva. That's fascinating. I'm sorry that I'm sorry that our format doesn't allow you to continue, but we will no doubt have more in the published accounts in time. Fantastic.